Let's talk about the difference between the wealth gap and the income gap. And just define for us what the difference is between wealth and income. Is that a meaningful distinction? And if so, why? So, Dr. Hamilton, let's start with you.
They're both extremely important and vital, but also very different. Technically, income is a flow. Income is a reward for an exchange, usually labor, that people get on a periodic basis. Its usage is often done, often goes towards consumption needs or subsistence needs, whereas wealth, in contrast, is a stock. Wealth is indicative of what you owe minus what you own minus what you owe. But perhaps more important, wealth also gives you the ability to have agency, particularly when it comes to finances in your life. If you were going to finance an expensive education, you likely aren't going to finance it out of income. If you're confronted with a health crisis and you don't have health insurance, it's probably going to be wealth that will afford you the ability to take care of that. If you want to influence local politics, those with wealth will be able to do so better than those with income. So again, briefly, income you should think of as a flow, wealth as a stock. Wealth is probably generated in a more intergenerational way, or is generated in a more intergenerational way, whereas income can be more contemporarily granted. So if we're thinking about differences, and then you also asked a question about gaps, so gaps in income versus gaps in wealth. If we're thinking about, say, the role of education, the role of education is probably more important in explaining income differences than it would be in explaining wealth differences, because wealth is more iterative. In other words, if you want to get wealth, it takes wealth. So wealth you can think of as more hard, fast, less variable, more of a stock, whereas income can fluctuate a little more.
Dr. Parramore, I'll turn this question to you. Let's talk about evidence of the existence of either or both, the income or wealth gap. And I just grabbed a headline, some clickbait. 3 men, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, and Warren Buffett, own as much as the bottom half of Americans. That certainly grabs your attention. Is that an accurate depiction of the degree of inequality in the United States?
I think that's why we're now referring to the age we live in as the new Gilded Age. There it is right there. And you were mentioning looking at different communities and how the wealth gap impacts them. I pay particular attention to the wealth gap when it concerns women. And we may have heard the statistic that women earn 79 cents on the dollar when compared to men. That's a pretty widely cited statistic. But a lot of people may not know that women own 32 cents on the dollar. So that's a huge gap. And when you're talking about women of color, it's pennies on the dollar. So this is a very serious problem. And, there's wealth and income disparities are different, but they are linked because wealth enables you to earn more. If you own a car, you can take advantage of more job opportunities. If you are lucky enough to own stocks, you can earn, you have income from dividends on those stocks. You can earn income from your savings. So the more wealth you have, the more income potential you have. I've been paying attention to this problem since I was a little girl because my mother, who grew up on a tobacco farm in North Carolina, my grandfather gave her $100 when she graduated from high school and said, have at it. She was lucky to get that. She could not attend the University of North Carolina because she was female. She had to attend what was then Greensboro Women's College. Waited tables, put herself through college, got her degree, got an advanced degree. When she was an assistant professor at North Carolina State in the early 70s, she went to buy a car, and the car dealer said, that's great. As soon as your husband comes down here and signs this piece of paper, you can have a car. Unfortunately, she was divorced. So she could not buy a car. This is only one generation ago, and the disparities, as I just mentioned, are still very serious.
So I want to come back to the impact on different groups, but let's go up a level again. Is the wealth gap, and presumably they're correlated, the wealth and income gap, is this unique to the United States, or are other advanced industrialized societies impacted by this as well? And I just grabbed the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of inequality, with 0 being complete equality and 1 being complete inequality. And in 2016, the United States was ranked 0.39 on that scale, which put us 6th between Turkey and Lithuania. Number 1, the most unequal society was South Africa at 0.62. But then down at the more equitable distribution were, not surprisingly, Iceland, Norway, and Denmark at 0.26. Are those meaningful distinctions? We often hear about the United States as a very stratified society, but is this something unique to us, or are other countries struggling with this as well?
It's certainly not unique to the United States, and you just offered some data. Clearly, the context matters. The context in South Africa is one where the majority population is the one that's at the bottom of the distribution, but yet they have gross inequality. In the United States, it's not necessarily that case, but ultimately being able to look across countries, especially from an academic standpoint, allows us to really understand the role of structure and power. I think that the key word in all of this notion of inequality, and it refutes a lot of, dare I say, neoliberal economic interpretations of the role of the market and being a fair arbiter in goods going to those that deserve versus those that don't deserve, effort being rewarded based on market attributes. What's missing from that narrative, and with what an analysis of inequality across country affords us, is the role of power and the role of structure. Lynn alluded to it already with the case of her mother. That was something structural that had nothing to do with her mother's effort, but rather a government policy, structure, or social norm that inhibited her in some way. So, at the risk of going on and on and on, I think a key thing is power in all these relationships.
Well, so let's probe that a little bit more. So, Dr. Parramore, you gave that. Thank you for sharing that example of your mother. What are some of those other structural drivers and causes of this factors that we know either from anecdotal experiences like your mother or research into this?
Well, when you're talking about the United States versus other countries, let's say countries in Europe, we do tend to have more of a problem with wealth and income inequality. And part of the reason for that is what causes people to fall behind the cost of health care, for example. We lack universal health care, and that is one of the policies that makes the disparity more serious in the United States. And if you're talking about evening out economic inequality, a more robust social safety net in the United States would certainly help us not fall behind so many of the other countries that have these programs.
Dr. Hamilton, what are some of the drivers and causes here?
Drivers and causes of inequality. Again, I think it's the iterative nature of economic and political power. Capital goes. Capital does what capital does. It consolidates and iterates. But then you bring in the other ingredient, and that becomes political power. The ability to use economic power to facilitate structures so that you can have even more economic power. So I think you get this relationship, again, around power of economics and politics, where people in their self-interest or groups in their self-interest try to consolidate the two. The last component of that relationship would be something like wealth. The existence of some permanent underclass, race. The existence of some permanent underclass by which you can manipulate, entice, seduce a dominant group to go along with a system of consolidation. Race becomes almost a tool by which you can seduce a population by saying, however unequal you may be in a vertical positioning, at least you're not them. At least you're not that other group. In this last election, it seemed to a large extent, Mexicans were the group that was vilified. Immigrants were the group that was vilified. So, we end up with a structure or system where we're able to codify an iterative relationship between economic and political power, and the way to get a dominant group to go along with it might be the enticement of using some other underclass by which you could juxtapose your relative position compared to them.
So let's unpack that a little bit and make it concrete. So one of the arguments that's out there, and we heard this a little bit in one of those sessions I mentioned earlier, is that a driver of inequality, both on the wealth and income spectrum, is automation. And one of the places where we're hearing this is from some of the great disruptors in Silicon Valley. So Mark Zuckerberg and others out there have made the case that the dawn of a new age of work, i.e. robots and other technologies performing this work, will lead to a situation in which we have permanent inequality because people can't generate the wealth and income they could before. And they are actually some of the most outspoken proponents of one of the things we're going to talk about in a minute, which is universal basic income. So try and take that argument and layer on those concepts that you were just articulating, right? So that's one we hear about. How would you make sense of that?
Yeah, I guess in a historical sense, and here's where I'm unified with many of my brethren economists, I'm not so threatened by automation as completely doing away with jobs. And I don't think it's new in American history. We obviously had the Industrial Revolution, for example. So the nature of work is certainly going to change. And right now, as we go through this automation, there are serious consequences to people in current industries that are losing their jobs. But we have no idea what the future of work is going to look like, what new types of jobs will arise. Now, of course, the people in Silicon Valley talk about a new form of automation that we haven't had in the past, and that is machine learning, machine iterative learning. So that's new. So we are in somewhat uncharted territory. That's one point. One point is I'm not as concerned about automation completely doing away with jobs and the sky is falling. But nonetheless, there are serious things that we need to be concerned with in that transition, which brings up the notion of UBI, Universal Basic Income, which a lot of people in Silicon Valley are clamoring for. My concerns around universal basic income is not the notion of government providing people with resources so that they can make choices and facilitate themselves and have the agency and the self-determination to pursue their own interests. I'm all for that. My concerns with UBI are largely practical. And practical in the sense that if you gave everybody in the economy the exact same dollar amount, that's almost the definition of inflation. And then also the other aspect is it becomes inequality enhancing. If you give a wealthy person $100, well, they don't have to consume it. They can turn around and invest that $100 and iteratively turn it into more wealth. If you give a poor person $100, by definition, they have to consume it. So you end up exacerbating inequality. Now, of course, the UBI people often say, well, we have a tax code to address that distribution, that maldistribution. But that's an inefficient use of addressing inequality, to use the tax code on the back end. So if we thought about a negative income tax or seeding some individuals more income than others, I have no problem with that. I think that's a useful program that could be enriching to Americans. I know I'm rambling on. I'll just get this other point in and we can come back to it. Another program that could provide for economic security against the onslaught of automation is a federal job guarantee. What if we offered as a guarantee from the federal government a job for anybody desiring to work, and not just a job to have them doing stuff like workfare, but a productive job? Even with automation, we have bridges, we have dams, and we have a whole care work ecology in America where there's real productive work that needs to take place, and a robot is not going to replace somebody, at least at this point, in terms of offering care.
So, yeah, go ahead.
I really agree that automation is sometimes hyped up as something to scare us all into thinking, well, this is just the way things are going to unfold, so get used to it. Economists are actually split about 50-50 on whether automation will decrease or increase the number of jobs. I use the example of the 1990s Probably many of you started that decade with a typewriter and ended it with a laptop computer. That was a huge era of technological advances. The unemployment rate did not go up during that decade. So the correlations historically do not necessarily show that jobs are going to be lost when there are periods of rapid innovation and automation and technology. So that's one thing. And then the other thing, when I hear a bunch of Silicon Valley guys advocating a policy, I start to get very suspicious. Why do they want basic income? Why is that? The same companies that will have entire departments dedicated to avoiding paying taxes. I put those things together, and it makes me very skeptical of their motives, that they want to shove off the responsibility of paying decent wages, of paying their taxes, of supporting the things that our society needs by just saying, well, we'll just have a basic income and leave it at that. And the thing is, to me, I would rather see something like Medicare for all before we start doing basic income, because if you have an extra $200 a month and you have to hand it all over to a bloated and dysfunctional health insurance system, well, how far does that get us? So I think we already have programs in place like Medicare, like Social Security, that have been proven to work very well, and we can expand those programs.
Good. I want to come back to both the universal basic income and to the existing policy regime that's in place. But I want to come back to one potential other driver, since you mentioned it, Dr. Hamilton. We heard a lot in this last campaign. You mentioned that immigrants, and particularly those from south of the border, were vilified. And the sort of policy argument there is that globalization and trade are what is driving economic inequality, and trade makes winners and losers. Is that an important part to this? And if so, yes.
No. It's a nuanced answer, but the short answer is yes. The short answer is we are losing some jobs to overseas infrastructures where workers can be paid a lot less than they are paid in the United States. I'm not anti-trade, but I'm also pro thinking about ways in which we can empower workers across the globe. So if we're going to have fair trade, then we should, I think, one policy is think about ways in which workers in other countries aren't exploited and are given a fair wage. And but the short answer to your question is yes, that's certainly an issue.
So I saw you nodding your head a little bit. What are your thoughts on this?
I basically agree. Although, again, when they're couched in terms that make it look like these are just sort of natural forces and there's no way we can intervene in them, then I would say, oh, absolutely, we can intervene. We can do jobs retraining programs for people who've been displaced by globalization, and we have not done a very good job with that. So there are ways that we can mitigate and offset those forces.
I'll jump in really quick, Trevor. You mentioned even earlier, I'm sorry, Dean Brown.
Trevor.
You mentioned earlier, is this an international phenomenon or something unique to the United States? I would recommend that everybody, if they get a chance, go out and see a film that didn't get a lot of recognition, but it's by Raoul Peck, who's a Haitian filmmaker, and it's titled Profit and Nothing But. And it's centered in the backdrop of Haiti after they had the earthquake, and brings this into a global context and goes really back to your question that you began with, and that is the consolidation of capital in general, not just in the United States, but across the globe. And the film really centers on the narratives of capitalism, couched in the terms of freedom, choice, is it really freedom, choice? And there's he's a filmmaker, so he has the art of being able to use allegories and narratives in a way that really gets at the issue in a way that a technocrat like myself is not able to come up with. So I highly recommend that.
Thanks for that suggestion. In just a minute, I'm going to open it up to you all. So again, the microphones are here, so you can start making your way to either side if you have a question. But I'm going to ask them each sort of another question, and then I'll open it up. You were saying that Medicare for All is one solution. Elaborate on that, or identify others that you think would be effective in reducing the wage and income.
Well, in a sense, if we had Medicare for All, that would be a form of giving back a basic income to people, because people have to spend so much of their earnings on healthcare, and of course the risk of bankruptcy and falling over the economic cliff is so high in the healthcare system that we do have. And I unfortunately, I don't think that Obamacare has really addressed some of the fundamental problems. And it's something that we can do. It's something that so many other countries do. This idea that we can't do in the United States, that's just elite talking. In fact, when you look at polls, even the majority of Republican voters want some kind of universal health care. This is what the people want. The problem is not with the people. The problem is that they're not being represented properly by politicians. You know, you hear the Democratic Party talking often about how difficult this is and how, you know, we will have to do it piecemeal. This is all baloney.
So knock away some of those purported impediments to Medicare.
Knock away some of those purported impediments to Medicare.
Well, it's a program that's already been in place for quite some time, and we have real data that shows that it works. You know, and the same thing with Social Security. When the financial crisis happened and people were out of jobs and they lost their homes, guess what? You know, provided they could get to a mailbox, their Social Security checks came. That is a program that has worked even in the most difficult times. So why not expand it? This would help. You know, going back to this issue of the wealth gap. This is one of the things that's so difficult for women. Social Security is not adequate right now. Really for most retirees, but women get hit particularly hard because they have often worked part-time or they've taken years out of the workforce to be with their children, etc. They live longer. It's simply, the problem with Social Security is not that it's going to be bankrupt in 30 years of these predictions. You know, economists are so great at predictions, right? Every time someone says, well, it's predicted that it's going to, you know, come on. The problem with Social Security is not that it's going to run out of money, it's that it's not paying out enough. That's the problem with Social Security.
Dr. Hamilton, I want to turn it over to you. I know a lot of your work with Sandy Darrick has been around baby bonds, which is another potential tool for addressing wealth and income gap. Tell us about those and what's the logic behind them and what's the evidence that they'll deliver on that promise.
Yeah, I mean, if we want to use catchphrases, we can say building Social Security over a lifetime. So the idea is that if you, the source of inequality, especially when it comes to wealth, is that some young adults have access to some seed capital or some structure that allows them to get into an asset like a home, like starting a new business, like an education without debt, that will passively appreciate over their lifetime. The vast majority of Americans don't save directly out of their income. They save because they have a vehicle for savings like a retirement account, or their assets literally just appreciate. A house grows as opposed to just paying rent, where you are offering your consumption payment to some landlord who has an asset that's appreciated. So this idea is saying that as a birthright, irrespective of your race, irrespective of your gender, irrespective of your family income, you get a stake in society. You get some capital that's set aside for you that's not beholden to the decisions your parents make, that when you become a young adult, it gives you an opportunity to take part in an asset that will potentially grow and give you economic security. We have stuff set aside for people at the twilight of their life, Social Security, but we have nothing beyond subsistence for somebody that's just starting at a key juncture in their life when they're a young adult. So that's the idea behind it.
Okay, class is still in session. Everybody outside is celebrating, but you guys are still in class. You have to come up and ask some questions. And I will use my professorial, okay, good, we have a question here. And sir, if you could come to that microphone. Go ahead, sir.
I want to start by saying thank you. This has been fascinating so far. I'm a lifelong capitalist and free market person, and so seeing what's happened inequality is very concerning because the market should fix everything, and it's not, and that's hard to see. So I turn to things like having to have the education systems and the infrastructures in place because we've got a globe that we're competing within, and they're doing it elsewhere, and we're not doing it here. So those things concern me a lot. Which is to say, the purist in me wants to see a solution come out of some kind of good free market perfection. All right, let's buy all that and set it aside and say it's not happening, so we need some structures in place like UBI. I'd like to hear you answer the question, why wouldn't we then put a sunset provision, UBI for a while to get us past, we came a long ways without UBI. Why do we need it now? So what we need it now to get past some bump in the road, but let's put a sunset provision on it because once we can get everybody up to speed and give them the education, then they're going to be on their own again, and we won't need this UBI to keep us going.
Dr. Parramore, I think it could be UBI or some of these other solutions too.
Thomas Piketty, the French economist, wrote a book about this thick, and
Nobody read it, by the way.
The only person who did. I actually read every page of that thing. So I can tell you that his conclusion is that inequality is not a bug of capitalism, it's a feature. The reason for that is that the return on wealth is greater than the increase in wages. And so you have this built-in disparity. The only way to fix that is for there to be some kind of intervention. So the issue that you raised, what could the intervention be? Could it be basic income for a period of time? You could have it for a period of time, but then if you stop it, and that's the only major intervention that you're doing, that equation that Thomas Piketty lays out is going to catch up again. So that's why I would lean towards programs that we could have in place, on a permanent basis.
And I guess I'll try to be quick. Dr. Parramore wrote what I think is perhaps the best article on baby bonds, including all the stuff I've written on it, even though I came up with the idea. and it leads with the title, An Idea That a Conservative Can Love. So baby bonds aren't anti-capitalism. It's saying, how about fairness where everybody has a shot at some of the benefits of capitalism, where they at least have some seed capital. Without capital, we know that a capitalist system just locks in inequality. So I love that title. I'll elaborate a little more. I don't think I'm anti-capitalism. What I'm arguing is that there is a role for the public sector to provide facilitation for people so that they can engage in social mobility. So right now, the framing of the market is one that it disciplines people, it disciplines poverty, that if you aren't engaging in activities that are productive, that require innovation, ingenuity, that the market will not reward you, but rather discipline your sloth. Now, we know that there are many people out there that work very hard and don't get rewarded for a host of reasons, most of which is power, and they don't have bargaining power in the labor market to begin with. The threat of being destitute from unemployment coerces you to take lower wages at the risk of not having any wages. So that's a power relationship. So what we're talking about with Medicare for all, with baby bonds, with a federal job guarantee, doesn't do away with capitalism. It says, how about reorient public power so that it disciplines the market, or disciplines firms in a way that if you are offering inadequate wages, or if you're offering inadequate products like healthcare, there is a public alternative, that there is some power for those that are consumers or workers where they have an alternative to go to in essential goods, not all goods. We don't need a public option for the party that's going on outside, but essential goods like healthcare, like access to finance, like access to capital, like a job, that there will be a public infrastructure in place that is productive and gives people some viable alternative so that the access, the quality, and the quantity is not rationed by a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, which is what firms, it's not a moral judgment. That's what firms are about. Their fiduciary responsibility is to their shareholders. The government has a different fiduciary responsibility. It's to the population, to consumers. So the government fulfills their fiduciary responsibility and ensures that people have a baseline by which they have dignity to take part in society.
Sir, you've been waiting patiently.
Thank you. Thank you to the panel. I'm Minister Kujenga Elias Shea. I'm an ambassador to the United Nations for all the people that claim to be Edenites and for all the poor folks and for the Hebrew Israelites scattered to the four corners of the earth and to the indigenous people. I am not a capitalist. I'm against monopoly finance capitalism. I'm a biblical communalist. I believe in sharing the wealth. I think that love should be the means of exchange, not money. Now, that may strike a lot of people as being very odd, but basically, monopoly finance capitalism enslaved millions and millions and millions of my folks in chattel slavery. My Native American people were killed by the millions and millions, and we've been oppressed for many, many years by monopoly finance capitalism. It still separates us today. You have the one percenters. I started the Occupy Wall Street movement by giving Michael Moore and his people the idea in 2010. They did it in 2011, we went in 2012. The picture of us on Wall Street in 2012. Very briefly, I'd like for you to look at two books. One, War is a Racket by General Smedley Butler. Number two, The Creature from Jekyll Island, talks about how the Federal Reserve was started. What we're dialoguing here about today, we've been doing for the last 10 years in the economic rights movement. Abolitionist movement, civil rights movement, and now the economic rights movement. Of course, you have the women's liberation movement coming out of the civil rights movement, and the gay rights movement as well coming out of civil rights. So we're for all of the movements of the people, and we are about ending credit card debt and ending student loan debt. That's what the t-shirts have up here. And we have methods to do that, and I just came looking for some Rosa Parks tonight, maybe some students or some people who want to sit down on the bus with us to really crank this, birth this baby. So I want to thank the panel for their time. Like I said, I'm not a capitalist. I don't mind free enterprise, but I do not agree with monopoly finance capitalism and the Federal Reserve Bank and what the one percenters have been doing to us for the last 400 years. I don't agree with that. It's been murder and mayhem, and it's time for that to stop.
Sir,
thank you for your time. I'll talk to you afterwards. If you want to come talk to me, I've got books, I've got cards.
We'd also welcome a question.
Well, the only question I would say, all the politicians that you have doing the healthcare for all, we know them. We've been to Congress, we've been to all those people, Joyce Beatty and all the Congress people, John Conyers and all of them, for Medicaid for all. We like the single-payer system. I don't know if you like the single-payer system or not, but the whole idea is that we've got to get even way beyond that, because the problems that are happening to the indigenous people of the planet and the women and everybody else who, it's a horrible thing. I mean, it's life and death. We're not in a vacuum here. There's a lot of books written on it. But what do you think about single payer? Dr. Kirwan?
Thumbs up.
Yeah, we can get more questions. The notion of bringing morality into economic decisions, I'm all for. I mean, that's not a bad thing to think about. I mean, in addition to thinking about self-interested goals of generating resources, we should also think about common humanity, common morality, and sustainability. Those are good goals to have.
And I'll just make a quick point. You brought up the issue of credit cards and student loan debt. My mother and any other woman before 1974 could not get a credit card, was not allowed to own a credit card. But even now, I think there was a study in 2012 that showed that women pay 0.5% more on interest on their credit cards even today. And there is a credit score disparity between men and women. And I haven't seen a breakdown of that on race, but I think
Trust me, it's large.
we could bet.
It's a new form of redlining.
We could put a bet on that. With the gender issue, women actually owe less, but they still have lower credit scores. Now, how could this be? It's because of the utilization issue. When women have lower incomes, they have to use a higher percentage of their available credit, and therefore they have lower credit scores, which cascades into all kinds of economic and financial trouble down the road. So, we by no means solve these problems.
Go ahead, question.
We're single women. I'm going to retire here in a couple of years. So I definitely support Medicare for all. Like you say, platform is there. We can make it work. Canada seems to be able to make it work just fine. And I think the point that we might be missing is that there's a lot of people who stay in jobs because of health coverage. People who don't want to go to college, and we need electricians, we need plumbers, we need all these kind of trades that people could go into. They don't go into it, again, because they can't afford it. They need health care. And on top of that, we have people who want to start businesses. They can't do that. Why? Because they don't have health care. How would that expand our economy if we allow people to then follow their heart and do what they want to do? And that would help everyone to access that. And I'm also part Native, so I get that. So if you could speak to that, how we can not only get people in college, but get people in the trades and get people to do things that they really want to do that this economy needs.
Great, thank you. Dr. Hamilton, Dr. Parramore.
I mean, you pretty much made the case. The job lock associated with not having a single payer health insurance could be inefficiency enhancing. It could make, it does make U.S. corporations less viable in an international context when other firms don't have to pay those costs. But then, another issue, and this goes back to the morality of it, it is perhaps the right thing to do. Perhaps when we are at our most vulnerable position, when we are sick, that the issue of finance should not be the relevant decision at that point. We shouldn't have that stigma. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't worry about finance. We have to pay for things. But that decision should happen well before we're at our most vulnerable. And to me, Medicare for all, the single payer, makes the most sense.
So Dr. Hamilton said that baby bonds, you coined the title, even a program that conservatives could love. We just heard an argument in favor of Medicare for all that sounds like even a conservative could love. So talk about the politics of Medicare for all and some of these other programs.
Well, here's a statistic that some conservatives, free market folks would love. Medicare for all, there have been very rigorous studies that show that it would save money in the overall economy because the current system that we have is so completely inefficient. So actually, if you want to talk about it strictly from like a GDP perspective, the research has been done. In fact, the Mercatus Center in Virginia, the very conservative, libertarian-leaning think tank, sort of accidentally put out a paper underscoring that very point. They were sort of disappointed to make that finding and disappointed to have it picked up that it would save money in the overall economy. So this is, but the lobbying industry associated with health insurance is blocking the way, and politicians that are in the pockets of those folks. That's what the problem is.
Question over here.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Appreciate the discussion. I'm new to Ohio, just moved here from Illinois. I was a lobbyist from the city of Chicago for 30 years. And so when I hear things like Medicare for all, I'm a pragmatist. And I'm thinking about the voting blocks and how you line that up. And it's interesting, I was listening to NPR on the way here, and there was an economist responding to Warren's Medicare for All. And this individual said it would be the largest tax hike in the history of the world to do Medicare for all. So that's the kind of thing that's out there. NPR too. Now, the other thing is, I was eligible for Medicare in November, and I was shocked at what I have to pay for insurance. It's not free. I pay $138 a month, and I pay another $130 a month to get doctor's visits paid for, and I have a deductible. So I pay $300 a month, and I have a deductible. So we can't afford Medicare for senior citizens. How are we going to do this for everybody? That's just my question.
Well, when somebody says...
Don't go away, I have a Chicago question for you. Hang on.
When somebody says to me, oh, your taxes are gonna go up $100 a month or $200 a month if we have Medicare for all, I say, you can have it. Because the amount that we pay per month for the again, bloated and dysfunctional health insurance system that we have is far in excess of that. So let's start cutting out that completely inefficient industry, then we'll find out what the real costs are. But I simply do not accept that premise that we cannot afford Medicare for all. Every other industrialized country is able to do this. This is something the United States is so far behind. And to interpret it as something that is fringe or something that is left-leaning, it is not. Again, the majority of the American voting population wants this, including Republicans. Republicans, when they are polled, say that they would prefer a universal healthcare system. So it's a political problem, I agree. It's a very daunting political problem. But it's not a daunting problem in terms of cost. It's not a daunting problem, I don't think, of convincing the public. I think the public is already knows that this is an important thing to have.
So here's my Chicago question for you. So interestingly, Chicago is one of the cities that's contemplating experimenting with universal basic income. So the city of Stockton in California is the first to roll it out. 130 or 40 people have received $500 a month since February, and it's to last for 18 months. Now, Chicago is contemplating doing $1,000 a month for 1,000 families. As a former lobbyist for the city, share some politics of how is that going to pass in Chicago, which has had challenged finances for some time.
Yeah, and it continues to, and I can say to you what I know about the tax burden in the state of Illinois, which carries Chicago. Chicago has 8 million people, the entire state has 11. So we're talking about a huge metropolitan area there. The metro area has 8 million. Not unsurprisingly, New York, California, and Illinois lost more citizens as a whole from those states in flight. Many people imagine and guess that the tax burden is substantial and they're leaving for those reasons. So there are also demographic things. You're talking about a baby boom population that is going to states that have zero income tax. I mean, Nevada, Washington, Florida. So these fiscal policies influence where people go. But I think Chicago is not anybody's example of a really well-run city that's very functional. In fact, it has enormous problems and burdens that I can't imagine it's sustaining another one.
Well, welcome to Ohio.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Question over here.
Yes. I think historically the example of cultures and societies that continue to drive and thrive is when they have expanding middle classes. And so to me, the idea of a universal basic income should be shifted to a universal basic skill set that our population has. And when you look at the sectors throwing rocks over the fence at each other to say it's your problem to fix or it's your problem to fix, I think when you look at the Industrial Revolution, our education system, not just educators, but businesses, education, parents, looked at preparing young people differently than they had in the agricultural system that we had. My sense is we have not done that. We still have the system in education, K-12 and candidly higher ed, where we haven't integrated the sectors of the employers who are currently hiring people, and particularly the future employers that are going to be hiring people in the future, to develop the skill set in the young people so we don't have to mandate an income. We can develop a skill set where young people and adults have the skill set to drive a progressive, expanding middle class that is counter to what we're experiencing today. So my question to you is, do you agree with the premise? And do you have a sense of how, I'm with Junior Achievement of Central Ohio, so we work with business people, government people, educators about how do we bring the sectors together, because we are not preparing young people. We do not have the mindset as adults to get young people ready for success in their careers. And so my question to you is, do you agree with this premise? And what are your thoughts about the skill set rather than the income?
Dr. Hamilton, you were talking a little bit earlier about some of these policy education or your guaranteed federal job proposal, obviously preparing people for certain kinds of skills as well. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I guess with skills training, I have no problems of investment in skills as long as there's a job attached to it at the end. What becomes pernicious is some of these job training programs that entice people who really are vulnerable to say, make something of your life. Get up off the couch. Come take out this loan and go to this community college and incur this debt, and then we still have nothing for you when you graduate. That's predatory in my estimation. But the notion of inequality being attached to a skills gap, here's where race offers a good deal of information. We know that if you are a head of household and black and have a college degree, your net wealth position is less than that of a comparable white family where the head dropped out of high school. We know that the unemployment gap persists throughout the education distribution between blacks and whites. We know that a black expectant mother with a college degree is more likely to have an infant death, and this is an issue particularly problematic in the state of Ohio, than a white woman who dropped out of high school. I'll give you one more. A black male with a college degree is 3 times more likely to die from stroke than a white man who dropped out of high school. So looking at education alone refutes the notion that education is the panacea for some of these structurally established disparities across race. I'm not anti-education. Of course, I'm at a university.
Good. I don't know if I signed your employment contract.
There's intrinsic value in education, and we as a country can afford to provide everybody with an Ohio State type education, the value that comes about from that. All those graduates that Dean Brown cited, the value that's going to accrue to them from having this experience in Ohio State goes well beyond the functional returns that the labor market might offer them. And as a society, we may decide that's what we desire, that's what we want, and that's what we're going to afford and give. And this relates back to the other question about can we afford these things. Well, first let me give what I believe to be a point of clarification. I'm not sure about the state of New York with regard to population, but the city of New York is not losing population. The city of New York is if anything, is growing in size. And then how we pay for things in general, state and local governments have to balance their budget because they're not sovereign currency issuers. The federal government, we are seeing that this rhetoric around the problems of debt and deficits, they have not materialized. Interest rates have remained low. The government can continue to borrow. The federal government is not like a household. In fact, this $2 trillion tax cut that was just passed, that's going to be in existence over the next decade, which I suspect many in this room have not experienced a tax reduction themselves because the vast majority of those benefits are going towards the elite, is not going to destroy our economy. Despite some of the sky is falling, the increased deficits and debt from that hike, although it's going to enrich an already wealthy class, it's not going to destroy our economy. So we can pay for things, The constraint on, so one, that choice of passing that $2 trillion is a lot of finance that could be used towards other human capability enhancing activities that we've been talking about. But on the other end, the only constraint on America is productivity itself. And there are plenty of things that I can come up with, and that many of you in this room can come up with, in areas that we have not been as productive as we can be. So we need to be careful with regards to the rhetoric of deficits and debt, which is often not demonstrated in an accurate way as a way to stop conversations before they even get started.
So one quick follow-up is, I don't equate educational achievement with skill set. I think that's a false choice, because we have, the majority of our population does not have a college degree. And to the earlier point about entrepreneurism, it's much easier for a low-income person in Columbus, Ohio, to see themselves as an entrepreneur than as a C-suite person in one of the towers. And so skill set does not equate necessarily to education. It's an and conversation, it's not an or. My point was, I believe as a culture, we need to align education and business, and everything's a business, faith, for-profit, not-for-profit. We need to equate education and engage people outside the education sector to develop the skill sets in young people so they choose their interests, skills, and values and path, not try to define a job that's based on some arbitrary thing that's linked to just specifically education.
I would just say really quickly too, the skills that I think are most important to employment, it's reading, writing, and arithmetic, really. I mean, skills, if you're talking about technical skills, for example, they become obsolete very quickly. If someone has a basic education and proficiency in those things that I mentioned, they can learn skills. Now, I'm not against skills training, but I do not equate education with a certain skill set. If I had graduated from college and focused on a skill set that would help me enter the internet economy, I would have lasted a minute. And I also think that Dr. Hamilton's work illuminates the fact that an education provides human capital, a social capital, that is also extremely important. It's the people that you meet, it's the networking that you have, it's the people that are going to follow up with you and be part of your cohort when you graduate. Those things are just as important to getting a job as your skill set.
The example I offered of looking across race at those with a college degree versus those that have dropped out of high school, if we don't have a perfect measure of skill, certainly one would not equate a black person with a college degree as having less skills than a white person who dropped out of high school. So in that example, I was trying to demonstrate that skills, education is not necessarily always the explanatory factor of disparities. In fact, perhaps we have the causality wrong sometimes. Perhaps it is the wealth itself that affords people the ability to acquire skills or acquire somewhat of what Dr. Parramore was alluding to, the credential by which we give credence to, like a college degree in the first place.
We're nearing 7 here, and I'll make sure we get everybody's question here. So let's go over here, and if you keep your question brief so that we can get a response and we get through everybody.
I'll keep it short. I guess one question I had is going back to kind of like the wealth gap. I know you said it kind of falls in on itself in terms of like that iteration. Yeah. What are some ways, because these I guess feel like they're a lot more about the income gap focused that way. So what are some ways that you can kind of break up that wealth gap, especially like when you're talking about like a new Gilded Age, that if they're so high at the top, like how can you break that up to get that more distributed?
Appreciate the question. I mean, frankly, I think we need the tax wealth at the high end. Not necessarily because we need the finance to pay for things, although that will create a great deal of finance to pay for things. But we began this panel talking about the iterative nature of both economic and political power. I think the wealthy have too much power in this country. I think that we need... I think that there is a role for government to simply not allow so much capture, and we've gotten to the point where we might be in a gilded age, where the top 0.1% of the nation controls as much wealth as the bottom 90% of the entire country. That's dysfunctional from a political standpoint. So that's one way, but that doesn't solve the problem of how do we enable people so that they can benefit from what wealth does for you. Because the real power of wealth is not the outcome itself, but rather what it affords you in terms of being able to do things. Wealth as an input for people to have control over their lives. So in that scenario, we've talked about baby bonds. We can talk about other policies as well, but at the risk, we know we have other people out there, I'll just say that we need an economic bill of rights that ensures everybody has some level of finance, capital, and dignity and self-determination so that they can do things with their lives. We've had economic bill of rights about human rights, we've had civil rights. The next maturation in our democracy is an economic bill of rights.
Great. Let's go to the question here, and Dr. Parramore will give you the first shot.
So one of the things that we are just now getting into is how are we going to pay for all this? And I was actually waiting for the top 10% more argument to come up because that's often what is shared. I'm a little disappointed that this argument is so one-sided. I do believe that speaks a lot to the groupthink at universities and the lack of diversity of thought. I find it hard to believe that there's nowhere at OSU where you could find someone to balance out this argument. I've heard a lot about Medicare for all and what that would do. We have a medical crisis now with a lack of nurses and doctors in a free market. And do you think that capping what a doctor or a nurse can make is going to make more people likely to go into the medical field or less likely? The BBC has reported multiple times that they do not have enough doctors and nurses because of the government control of healthcare there. In Canada, people wait months just to see specialists. My mother had cancer, and I'm so glad that she only had to wait a few weeks to see a specialist. I would hate to see something like that come here. One of the things that I did not hear talked about is the fact that Canada has tried universal basic income twice, and they found that both times it was a failure. In fact, the second time they tried it, most recently in 2016, they had to kill the experiment because it was too expensive to continue. It was a 4-year study, and they only got halfway through. So, given the fact that the IRS, and this is data that you can get from the IRS's website, the top 10% make up the lion's share of the revenue collected by the IRS. They also pay more into Social Security, but because of payments being capped, they actually get less out of Social Security and, by extension, subsidize it for the rest of us. So we're always talking about the top 10%. And by the way, to get into the top 10%, you only have to make $150,000. So there are a lot of doctors at OSU who fit that bill. And now we also want to reduce what they're going to make under a Medicare for All program. So I just don't understand, eventually you're going to have to expand the tax base to affect some of the middle income people that you're hoping to save. And I'm just wondering where all this money is going to come from. And thank you very much.
Thanks for your perspective. Let's Dr. Parramore, let's hear your response.
Where is the money going to come from? Have you ever noticed that when we have a war, the money comes? Where does it come from? Where do the trillions of dollars for that come from? To me, investment of this kind is more about priorities than it is where is the money coming from.
I would also like to say that over the years, Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security eat up more and more of our national budget. So when actually that's true, that's from NPR's reporting and multiple sources. Those 3 programs now make up 3/4 of our budget. So when they talk about the budget, when they're arguing over how much to give to the military, the Department of Education, that's 1/4 of our national budget because it's been eaten away over the years by those 3 programs. And I believe that they do things that are good, don't get me wrong, but the fact is that Medicare and Medicaid have done nothing to control the cost of medical services. So if we want to go to a single payer system, what guarantees, since they haven't done so far, are you going to give us that our medical costs aren't going to go up?
Well, I'll just take one part of this issue in the interest of time. You asked about doctors not being able to make the high salaries that they can make in so-called free market system. You have a system in California, a Kaiser Permanente, for example, where it's more of a kind of program that you would see under universal health care, and the doctors work together and their salaries are capped. And there doesn't seem to be a lack of doctors, and it seems in reporting that a lot of doctors prefer to work in that kind of system. There's more cooperation between them. They're not sort of out independently trying to run a business for themselves. There's some people who really prefer that system. Now, doctors in the Northeast, where I live, tend to work more independently and want to have those giant incomes. It's true. There's more of a culture that supports that. But again, I think in the places where this has been tried, like California, the results look pretty good, and people are getting pretty good health care. So I would say just look for where it's happening.
So you get the last question. Now we're at 7:10, so I want to make sure we get everybody the Blue Jackets game.
Oh, thank you. First, I want to make a shameless plug for Andrew Yang. He's running on the platform of Universal Basic Income. I'm a data scientist here in Columbus, and my job is machine learning. And so we've had automation come in the past, we've overcome it, but never before have we had a technology that will replace within 15 years millions of jobs, millions of truck drivers. Artificial intelligence, machine learning will diagnose x-rays and scans 10% more effectively and much quicker than people who spend tens of thousands of dollars in years learning how to do it. And part of the problem with automation is that it cuts out the worker from that economic loop. So normally people, work for firms and they get, wages. With automation, I mean, they're not going to be working for these firms. Amazon, Microsoft, and Toyota are partnering to replace all their factory workers and warehouse workers with robots. And so how are we going to reconnect the loop where, we in the economy start to see that income again? So my question is, why does Medicare for All and in-kind benefits outweigh the benefits of a simple, straight cash benefit program?
Give you both an opportunity to answer, and we'll conclude with that. So you get to answer that question and any last concluding thoughts you might have.
So the issue of, is this unprecedented, the moment that we're in with regards to technological change? I guess I'd push it back a little bit and say that the Industrial Revolution, with regard to proportional displacement of jobs, was probably more pronounced than the moment that we're in. But you bring up another issue, which is machine learning. And that is indeed different than what the Industrial Revolution, what took place with the Industrial Revolution. So there is somewhat uncharted territory. I guess some of it is speculative on my end and your end. And I don't think we should ignore the potential displacement. There's going to be real pain, and there is real pain associated with this displacement. But there will be new jobs that will emerge. I strongly believe that. And that's why I've been talking about a federal job guarantee, in my view, which is the best offer, because there's value in work as well. I enjoy going to work. I enjoy being in a social group where my efforts are being used for some productive endeavor, and the endeavor is meaningful. And there, again, plenty of things that the private sector is not doing that we as a society could benefit from. And I think that there are lessons from the WPA, CCC, and during the New Deal period, in which we not only provided work for people, we facilitated the private sector with roads and bridges and helped facilitate new types of jobs. We could literally green our entire economy with a federal job guarantee. We could take this on an international level and think about a Marshall Plan for the entire world if we're worried about the threat of war. There's pretending that we can put Americans to work to define the type of society that we want. And that doesn't displace the private sector. There is still a role for the private sector. I want to, in conclusion, go back to some of the questions that were raised
raised before. And first, thank the person who asked the question, because this is not necessarily, right, it is brave for you to get up and ask the questions that you ask, and you ask them with sincerity, so I appreciate it and I thank you for that. I would respond to them with regards to the issue of is there a crisis for doctors and nurses if we were to have a Medicare for all where their salaries would be so low that we would generate shortages. Right now we have distributional problems already. So even with our current infrastructure of nurses and doctors, there's plenty of underserved communities. There are Native American reservations where there's lack of health care. There are inner city areas where there aren't enough specialists in certain fields that are serving that population. So I think that we need to be cognizant of the distribution with it. And Medicare for all does not necessarily do away with marketized solutions. So if somebody wealthy wants to jump a queue and go to a private doctor for fee-for-service, let them. Let the market work the way it's intended to work at the high end. But for Americans in general that are vulnerable to the pricing and rationing that comes about from insurance companies, we can make a decision as a society that we don't want that to happen. We want to put our value in ensuring that people have the human capabilities to do things productive in their lives. A couple other things, UBI. You know, I'm not a fan of UBI where everybody gets a basic income at the same level. It's expensive, and there are other ways in which we can spend money on a more productive level, in a more efficient and distributionally fair manner. But I am for the possibility, like in Stockton, where you give X number of people who are of a certain income to manage their own lives, where it's not conditional cash transfers, where we say you have to jump through this hoop in order to get it, but rather you as an individual can make better decisions about where this money needs to go for your own life than the federal government. I'm all for that, and I think a lot of these experiments are doing that, and I'm supportive of them. The last thing I want to go to is the notion of tax that was brought up. We said the top 0.1%. So when Senator Sanders and Senator Warren talk about their millionaire taxes, they're talking about the top 0.1% often, which is not a group that makes $150,000, but rather a group that makes over $1.5 million. And you point out that a lot of the tax revenue comes from high earners. Well, if you think about it as a proportion of what they earn and put it in those terms, there are a lot of middle class individuals that are offering the federal government a larger portion of their income that they earn than the top earners. So what we're talking about, in my view, is fairness. Yeah, they pay more because they earn more, but proportionally they aren't. You know, there's recent reports right now about Amazon, about Delta not paying any corporate tax, and Dr. Parramore mentioned earlier that they have invested heavily in figuring out ways that they don't pay taxes. So we're talking about a more fair system. And then the last point I'll end on is that what I've been trying to describe with regards to making a structure where those at the top pay more in terms of taxes is not necessarily so that we can pay for things, although it will generate a lot of finance. What I'm talking about is fairness. They have too much power at the top in this iterative system of political and economic power. So I'm talking about reigning in plutocracy. In order to pay for things, again, we have created this narrative that the federal government is like a household and that debt is evil and deficit is evil. In fact, if the federal government were to pay off all their debt tomorrow, we would have an economic crisis. In essence, they would make too little liquidity out there for us to function as an economy. There is good debt in our society. So I'm talking about federal government using their resources not to enrich those at the top, but using our resources, and even if that means deficit spending, so as to offer Americans human capabilities so we can really do and reach the capacities that human beings can reach.
And I think to Dr. Hamilton's point, I don't even like the term government spending in the context of things like healthcare and education, because spending evokes something that is gone, that, you know, once you spent it, it doesn't exist anymore. But it's really investment that has multiple returns in the future. And I think that's a really important point to make. We're talking about investments in human beings, investments in our society. And all of the ideas that have been discussed tonight, and you know, there are advantages and disadvantages to every program and every policy. But we better do something. Because as that formula that Thomas Piketty laid out, R is greater than G, the return on wealth is greater than the return on the economy, the rise in wages. The tipping point will come, and this is being felt all over the world. So if we're going to do away with our middle class and have an unequal society, there will come a point in which people will not accept that anymore. Yep. And hopefully we can do this in a nonviolent way, in the way that, you know, we come to a social consensus on how to rebalance our economy. But in history, it has gone in uglier ways, and I hope that we don't have to experience that. I hope that we can do this as a peaceful society and a democracy. But if we don't, that tipping point will be reached eventually.
So on that hopeful note, let me thank you for all being active and engaged citizens in a civil discourse here tonight. It was a pleasure. I learned a lot and stimulated a lot of ideas, and hopefully it did the same for you. This ends our dialogue series for the year. We will start again in September. Look on your emails for next year's slate of events. Hope to see many of you there. And so to conclude, please join me in thanking Dr. Parramore and Dr.